Thank you very much for the introduction. Well, hello everyone. I'm excited to be presenting at my first Honda Supply Chain conference. So we'll get into it. I'm going to be presenting on pass-through parts today. So using turnaround EDI. So unless you're not familiar, that is the concept of receiving inbound EDI and immediately turning it around to another mailbox to then send to a third party. Okay. So I'm going to be using a customer use case, recent project that we've been working on and launched. They may be with us today, I'm not sure, but sorry, having some technical difficulties here. Okay, so about the companies. So Subaru is the end customer. Subaru purchases parts from Newman Technology, and Newman turns around and purchases those manufactured parts from UACJ Metal Components. So UACJ produces, packs, and labels the inventory, ships it to Newman, and then Newman, based on Subaru provided sequences, will ship to Subaru release requirements. Okay. So the main challenge with this scenario is that Subaru sends release-specific information that needs to be provided on the printed inventory labels that ship from Newman. The main challenge was that in order for Newman to communicate that release detail to UACJ, it was a very manual process. We're going to see on the next slide in a minute a couple of the specific pieces of information that needed to be communicated and ultimately needed to be printed, pulling from data fields on the release itself. So the typical 862 received from Newman, once it was received from Subaru, didn't have a method for automatically including that information on the releases, the ship schedule releases sent to UACJ. So what they did prior was using typical MRP demand and sending against a combination of discrete and blanket supplier purchase orders from Newman to UACJ. And there were often challenges in meeting the one-day ship sequence dates and requirements just because of that manual process. So ultimately, Newman was being forced to receive the inventory in, but relabel it so that the label format, which UACJ was printing according to Subaru's labeling requirements, they were forced to reprint it so that that release-specific information housed only in Newman at this point would print on those labels. Okay. So here's an example of one of the labels. This is a Subaru standard label requirement, this particular scenario. And a couple of the fields on here to note, first being the EDI release number. So this is the release number sent from Subaru, and these are sequenced. So the current setup, or the setup prior also, was they would send a single PO, single blanket PO by part number. That part number would obviously include multiple releases, and they would usually send on Fridays 4 days worth of ship schedule releases, combined with about 3 weeks of forecast release schedules on the 830 as well. Then the Kanban number populated as well. This is the EDI Kanban number on the release, as well as the line code 13, which was a warehouse identifier. And then the line code in the bottom there, which is a sequence loading. So the challenge really was, in order to get all of this information to UACJ to populate on the releases loaded, they would have to communicate via email, include it on note lines on the PO, the supplier PO releases, what have you. So our solution. So stepping through these numbered steps here, Subaru will send the 830 and 862 EDI documents, and Newman will receive those to their customer mailbox. on that mailbox, obviously, are the 830 and 862 documents. And on those documents, we specify that they are turnaround documents and specify a turnaround mailbox also in the receiving PCN, which in this case, at this step is Newman. Once those documents are loaded into the customer mailbox, they are immediately turned around to the turnaround mailbox, which has the destination code to be sent to UACJ. So in step 2, the exact same 830 and 862 from Subaru is turned around and loaded to the UACJ receiving mailbox with all of the release data populated. Obviously, this eliminates the manual steps in between and no longer needs to be input or communicated from Newman prior to production. So a big piece of this right now is that UACJ receives this release information, and to schedule their production for the week, they're creating jobs from the Newman customer orders that are ultimately loaded from Subaru customer orders. And they produce and print those inventory labels line side with Subaru release information pre-populated. At that point, they ship to Newman, and Newman receives the 856, which loads the inventory. And as soon as the inventory shows up on their dock, it's pre-labeled and just can immediately be set aside and sent to Subaru when necessary. Okay. So there are a couple considerations. I'm actually going to back up one real quick. There are a couple considerations I mentioned. The first being that the customer purchase order from in Newman's PCN for Subaru, like I said, they send one part per purchase order, and they will send anywhere from 1 to 2 releases with specific DO numbers, which are the release numbers. Those load accordingly and will ship throughout the week. The same needs to be set up in the UACJ PCN, and that is the identical customer purchase order number set up on a blanket, and on the 830 and 862 documents, we will enforce the match on that PO number so that we can maintain the release loads in comparison to the same way they load in Newman. So the releases from Subaru are maintained identically in Newman and UACJ automatically. Okay, so our next step, something we've just finished implementing the first step. This next one is we will begin working on very soon, and that is to turn around those same documents to another one of Newman's suppliers. So we run into the issue where we cannot turn around a document to more than one turnaround mailbox in a single PCN. So the idea here is Subaru sends Newman the 830 and 862, and for the 2 suppliers in question, UACJ and Blevins, we can only send to one of those via the turnaround. So our solution to that will be in UACJ, setting up an additional turnaround mailbox that once the 830 and 862 are received in UACJ, they will immediately be turned around to a Blevins mailbox and sent through. So at that point, all of the releases will live in tandem and be maintained in tandem from the single 830 and 862 outbound transaction from Subaru. Okay. And that is the end of my presentation.
Okay, if anybody has any questions for Steve, go ahead and raise your hand or throw them in the question box. Let's see what we have here. I think we have. Let's see, I do have one question here. I think. So what happens if the 830 and 862 sent from Subaru include parts that UACJ does not manufacture for Newman?
Great question. Probably something I should have included in that explanation. So typically when parts that the receiving customer does not manufacture, you will get an EDI load error. So we use the load error exception list, and that in Plex allows you to specify customer part numbers that when found on the inbound EDI document, they'll immediately be ignored. Now, it's worth mentioning that the receiving PCN, so Newman to start out, all of the releases will be loaded there and the document turned around to UACJ. Even in this example here that we were talking about, those do include parts that UACJ does not manufacture at all. So we set up the load error exceptions, and they are not seen as an error when loading. So when they find the customer part number, it skips over them and so forth. Now that doesn't mean that the additionally turned around EDI documents to Blevins will not include that data. It's just simply that the receiving PCN doesn't consider it when it's evaluating or validating the part numbers and releases loaded.
Okay, great. Now I have a few more questions. Actually, is the UACJ 856 back to Newman using the Subaru 856 template, or is it just the standard Plex version 4010 template?
I believe it is the standard Plex version. I would honestly have to confirm that.
Okay, no problem. Let's see. Are you using subcontract EDI configuration?
Currently, no. We did consider actually presenting on that concept. Our very own Karen Patterson delivered a presentation on that concept, I think a year or two ago. This is somewhat similar, but because we are not drop shipping and are shipping direct to Newman from UACJ and then just passing those through, we did not have to take that into consideration.
Okay, great. This also requires the supplier at least to be a Plex customer, correct?
That would be correct. Now, you can turn it around to another approved trading partner. The communication back and forth, though, would be dependent on that trading partner, of course.
Okay, one last question. It says, we do this with Nissan, and Nissan set up so maybe not a question as more as just some information. It says that they do this with Nissan, and Nissan set up a separate destination code so it separates the parts out. That was a comment from Peter Robinson.
I'm curious to know if that's because the receiving system couldn't or didn't know to handle the load error exceptions. If you guys are the receiving PCN or system that you're talking about, there is the load error exception tool that you can use to utilize that if interested. So, of course, reach out if you'd like any help with it.
And Tamara commented that the 856 is 856 Subaru Common.
Thank you. Tammy is our Newman representative. Thank you for joining, Tammy.
Okay, and I do want to go ahead and say that we did get an answer on the OEM question that we had earlier, and that is Honda, Toyota, BMW, GM, and Ford. And they're also considering John Deere and Cat. So that is the answer to the OEMs that are on Plex's list.